Hello, and welcome to the Boston Globe Sustainability Week. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to thank our underwriters for their support. Philips, our presenting sponsor, as well as the International Business School at Brandeis University and the Museum of Science. On behalf of all of us, we hope you enjoy the program.
Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Boston.com Book Club. Our program today is part of Boston.com's Sustainability Week, presented by Philips and sponsored by Brandeis and the Museum of Science. My name is Steph Schmidt. I'm the manager and buyer at Water Street Bookstore in Exeter, New Hampshire. We've been around for 31 years and we are located just about an hour north of Boston, so come visit us. And we're here today to talk with Keith O'Brien about his brand new book, Paradise Falls, the true story of an environmental catastrophe. Here's my very well-worn galley copy. You can buy yours in hardcover though, a nice hardcover. I also want to start by thanking the Boston.com Book Club for including me, and also to Paul Swiden of the Silver Unicorn Bookstore in Acton, Mass for helping to organize this. And thank you all for joining us on this beautiful Earth Day. So as we talk, there's a Q&A button located at the bottom of the screen, and I'll try to get to your questions as they come in. And this presentation is being recorded and will be available after the event. So let me begin by introducing Keith. Keith O'Brien is a New York Times bestselling author and award-winning journalist. He's written 3 books, including the best-selling Fly Girls. He's been a finalist for the PEN ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing and has contributed to National Public Radio. He's also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and Slate, among others. He's a former staff writer for the Boston Globe and the New Orleans Times-Picayune. As a newspaper reporter, he won multiple awards, including the Casey Medal for Meritorious Journalism. He lives in New Hampshire with his wife and 2 children, and he's one of our wonderful local authors at Water Street Bookstore. I just noticed today that there was a wonderful Boston Globe review that came in for the book, and I'm just going to quote a little bit from it because it's so great. Chris Vogner wrote, "Paradise Falls is a gloriously quotidian thriller about people forced to find and use their inner strength. After all these years, they are fortunate to have a chronicler as focused and thoughtful as O'Brien. He brings their courage back to life." And I totally agree. So welcome, Keith.
Thank you, Steph. It's good to be here. And thank you all for coming out during your lunch breaks.
Well, Keith, why don't you start by giving us an overview of the book for people who don't know?
Sure. So some folks will remember or will recognize the words Love Canal. But I think most people have completely forgotten what happened there. And so maybe, I guess for starters, Steph, I just give a brief foundation for the story. This was one of the great environmental crises of the 20th century. It was not the first environmental crisis. It wasn't the worst environmental crisis, but it was in many ways one of the most shocking because of its location and because of the ripple effects that this disaster created, both in U.S. environmental policy and in the environmental movement. The Love Canal actually at one time was a canal. In the 1890s, a man named William T. Love, who was a bit of an entrepreneur and also a bit of a grifter, showed up in Niagara Falls, New York. And he had a grand plan. William Love was going to carve an 11-mile canal, a cut through essentially, connecting the upriver side of the Niagara River, just above the waterfalls that we all know, to the downriver side of the Niagara River on the other side of the falls. And it was going to be a small channel that would create hydroelectric power. And he was going to build this grand city, a model city at its terminus. And William T. Love made it about a half a mile before he ran out of money and also just willpower to do the work. And he disappeared. And this canal then sat there 6 miles due east of downtown Niagara Falls. For anyone who's ever been there, this is just 6 miles straight up river from the waterfalls, just there on the edge of town. And it sat there for decades. And then in the 1940s and 50s, one of the largest employers in town, a company named Hooker Chemical, a very large a chemical manufacturer that would one day be acquired by Occidental Petroleum, began using the canal as a dump for its chemical wastes and residue. And it used it for about 10 years. And then in 1952, it began having discussions with the city of Niagara Falls about selling the land to the Board of Education. To be clear, this was a conversation that was started by the Board of Education. The city was growing in the post-war years, just as many cities were. And the population was pushing east to the edge of town in Niagara Falls as more and more people moved to town to take those chemical factory jobs. And, you know, the school district needed new facilities, and they reached out, inquired about the landfill. And after many months of conversations, and I should note, much hesitation, at least initially, from Hooker, they did sell the land to the Board of Education for $1. Up goes the school, around it grows a neighborhood of about 1,000 families in all, Black and white. And you know, these secrets then remain buried, well known by people in power in Niagara Falls, but not by almost anyone else, and certainly not by the people who moved to this neighborhood, who bought homes in this neighborhood, who sent their children to that school. And it takes about 20 years before these problems begin to surface in ways that can no longer be ignored. And that's really where my characters, the protagonists at the heart of Paradise Falls, begin to fight back.
Let's talk a bit about the community there in that area, in Niagara Falls, and in those neighborhoods. Aside from the health problems, it sounds like this idyllic place to raise a family, at these close-knit neighbors, this wonderful school within walking distance of their homes, these good manufacturing jobs. They had these great outdoor spaces where the kids played. What was that place like? And then how does that all tie in with your title, Paradise Falls?
So, yeah, I mean, this was a desirable place. This was a working class neighborhood, but it was a working class neighborhood where people were buying that first piece of the American dream and scraping their way to the middle class on factory workers' wages. And so, you know, the homes there were small. They were all ranches, no two-story homes, all single-story ranchers, 2-3 bedrooms. And then there were also public housing just on the downtown side of the canal. About 250 to 300 families lived there. And this was, again, desirable public housing, not a large, you know, red brick building, but rather clusters of townhomes that had been built by the city specifically for families, for families with, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 children. And so people had moved there, you know, to either get that piece of the American dream or find a better home. And many of them had moved there because of its proximity to that school right at the heart of the neighborhood on this big swath of rectangular land that had really never been fully developed, which was sort of curious to people. And so back to the title, you know, and Steph, you know this, certainly, you know, you write a book that has like 100,000 words in it, and then you spend with your publisher and your editors and your publicists and various folks, you know, hours and hours and hours talking about 2 or 3 or 5 words that are ultimately going to be your title. And, you know, I didn't want to call the book Love Canal or even really have it in its name, because I feel like if you lived through it, you have this shorthand feeling of idea of what it was that's maybe not accurate. And then if you didn't live through it, if you're younger than, say, 42 years old, you might not have ever heard of it at all. And then the term is sort of weird, like love canal. What is that, you know? So I really knew from the outset that I wanted to do something here that was more than just the headlines that people may remember. And I think if you do remember it, you think about the headlines of the disaster and the toxic waste coming out and people essentially running from their homes. And I wanted to capture it as it really played out, which was this place that people wanted to live, and then it having it all fall apart. And so, you know, that sort of brought to mind this idea of paradise, or a suburban paradise, and then, you know, the title itself is a bit of a, you know, a double entendre. It's like, you know, it's Paradise Falls, and then sometimes Paradise Falls.
Yeah, it really works. Um, let's talk about the chemicals that were found there and what were some of the health repercussions that people suffered.
So Hooker Chemical, or I guess to step back for a moment, for those who don't know, in the middle part of the 20th century, Niagara Falls was a hub for chemical manufacturing. Many companies had moved there to harness the power of the river right there, you know, flowing through, and also the salt deposits that were naturally in the ground there. So there were many chemical companies dotting the landscape up and down the Niagara River. Really, between the waterfalls that people know and this neighborhood was just a stretch of chemical plants. And Hooker, you know, was one of them. And they were very profitable and very successful. They specialized in many things, but I'll mention two in particular. They created in great volume some weapons of war. In particular, they produced something called thionyl chloride there. Now that compound, that chemical, isn't going to ring a bell for most people, but people will know what thionyl chloride was used for. It's the fundamental element of mustard gas, the poison gas that Hooker generated in great volumes during World War I and after it. And that is buried in part in the old canal in that landfill. The other thing that Hooker produced a lot of were various pesticides and insecticides, or rather the compounds that would be used for the pesticides and insecticides. And those also ended up in the canal in great volume, the wastes and the residues. And, you know, there's some stunning scenes that are in court depositions and legal documents that were produced much later, where Hooker employees recounted being out at the canal in the 40s or early 50s and watching these trucks roll up, especially on a Monday, after a long weekend or a long week of production, and they just be loaded down with 55-gallon drums of chemical waste, and at times they were sort of just dropped helter-skelter into the canal, buried anywhere from 8 to 25 feet underground. And Hooker knew that some of these chemicals were volatile. In particular, thionyl chloride. It was known to react violently with water, which of course would end up in the canal or would already be in the canal when they were dumping these drums. And so at times, the workers recalled actually puncturing the drums on the truck bed, perched over the hole in the ground before dumping them, and then pushing it in and watching it sort of bubble and boil out, because they didn't want the water to seep in to these drums over time by accident and then have something happen beneath the ground. So they thought it was better to pierce them before putting them in the ground. And then again, and I think, especially even for me, having lived inside this story for so long, sometimes you fail to recognize the absurdity of what we're talking about here. Then later, this land is sold to the Board of Education, where a school is built, And so I think the thing that I began to recognize about this story, and the thing that I think is so relevant about this story for today, is that it wasn't just one poor decision that led to the problems in this neighborhood, but a litany of poor decisions by multiple agencies and entities over time. Of course, Hooker, but also the Board of Education, the city of Niagara Falls, multiple poor decisions over time that led to the problems. And then equally as powerful and relevant, I think, is that it wasn't just one protest or one angry letter or one angry phone call that turns the tide in this neighborhood, but 2 years of such things, a concerted effort by ordinary people, and ultimately a legion of them that forces the change in this neighborhood. And that, I think, is an incredibly relevant tale for the world we're living in today.
Well, yeah, let's talk about those incredible women. Lois Gibbs is really the woman who really started everything, and she's so incredible. She was kind of complicated. There were some divisions in the neighborhoods surrounding her work, but she accomplished so much. Why don't you tell us about how she got involved and her results?
Yes, I know you love Lois Gibbs, Steph, and lots of people do. By 1980, just for reference, Lois Gibbs had become one of the most famous or notorious citizen activists in America, and it began purely by accident. In 1977, Lois Gibbs was 26 years old, and she was a mother of 2 kids on the east side of Niagara Falls. She lived on 101st Street, 2 blocks to the east of that school and that playground, that old canal land, which of course she did not know about. And she was a factory worker's wife, stay-at-home mom, a housewife, as they would have said at the time. And Lois actually had barely graduated from high school, and she was self-conscious about that. She was the kind of person who stayed quiet at teacher conferences or PTA meetings. She didn't want to speak up and have anyone think that she wasn't smart enough. And then in 1977, her oldest child, Michael Gibbs, begins attending kindergarten at that school in the neighborhood. And she like any mother would do, walks him there on their first day, and is very excited about, her son being in school. And by Christmas that year, Michael Gibbs, previously healthy, is now suffering from seizures. And, the doctors, tell Lois that sometimes this happens. And it's true. Sometimes it does. Even doctors today will tell you that, a child suffering from seizures might just be idiopathic, meaning we don't know what causes it. And they put him on medication, and she begrudgingly accepted this diagnosis. But in the spring of 1978, Lois begins to read small stories at first in the Niagara Gazette, which reported that state officials were looking into some chemicals that had been buried in the ground in the heart of her neighborhood. And Lois at that point does, what mothers do. She begins connecting the dots to what's happening in the outside world, what's happening in her house. And at that point, she does what any parent might do. She makes a modest request. Lois goes to the school district and she asks that, based on what she's reading in the newspaper and her son's recent diagnosis, she asks that they move him to a different school for first grade in the September 1978. And I often wonder how this story might be different, or this history might be different, if they had satisfied that request. But they don't. They tell her the school is fine, the land is safe, and her son's seizures are probably the result of something else. And at that point, Lois is angry. And she begins to go door to door in her neighborhood, gathering signatures on a petition. And the petition at that point is just, again, rather modest. Lois is asking only to shut down the school until they can learn more. And so she is stunned on August 2nd, 1978, when in Albany, the top health officials announce that not only are they going to shut down that school, they're going to recommend evacuation for roughly 200 families around the old canal. And then they're going to actually, a few days later, order evacuation for those families. And Lois's house is on 101st Street, just outside that first evacuation zone, just are 700 other families. And now everyone is wondering, where to draw the line, where the risks really end. And that's where really the fight begins. And, as people can imagine, this is an incredibly stressful time that begins to unfold for the next 2 years. I used to be a reporter in New Orleans, and I covered Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina 17 years ago in New Orleans. And, in the wake of that disaster, which of course was, in its own way, an environmental disaster, families fell apart. Spouses got divorced. People committed suicide because they had lost everything, or they were trapped in their homes, or they were worried they would never get their money out of their homes. Neighbors at times turned on neighbors in New Orleans, in 2005, 2006. And that happened here, at Love Canal. And so, multiple factions begin to emerge, as people try to escape their homes. Lois Gibbs is leading one of them, and in some ways draws the most media attention, in part because of who she is, and in part because of what she does. And that earns her fame and notoriety, allies, and also foes.
Why don't we talk a bit about the sort of racial and economic divide that was between the neighbors? There were homeowners, and there were also renters, as you said, and they were all affected by the situation, but they had really different perspectives. Some of them couldn't just up and move. How did the sort of differing perspectives affect how they organized and how it was handled?
So, if you imagine this neighborhood as a sort of a large rectangle, to the east and to the north, there were homes, and there were also homes to the west. But there was, on that western edge, this public housing development that I mentioned. It was called Griffin Manor, home to about 250 to 300 families. These are working class folks, white and Black, who had moved to this public housing development because they had multiple children. And these townhomes really were built for that purpose. And, in 1978, when Lois Gibbs is beginning to connect dots, so is a woman at Griffin Manor. Her name was Aline Thornton. And Aline was a Black woman and a mother of 6 kids. And she had spent most of her life at Griffin Manor. Aline had spent the tail end of her childhood there, and then moved away, and then returned to raise her own kids. And when she begins to read what's happening, Aline, she also begins to connect it to what had happened in her life. Her third child was born in the 1960s. It was a boy. His name was Gregory Thornton. And Gregory didn't even live to his 2nd birthday. He died of leukemia, which again, idiopathic. We don't know what causes it. But Aline, begins to wonder if perhaps the chemicals that people are now discussing buried in her neighborhood might have had an effect on that. And, the homeowners and the renters, and I do hesitate to use that word in the book or even in conversation, because they were residents, they were people living there too. These children all went to school together. They played on the same Little League baseball teams. This was actually a very diverse neighborhood by 1970s standards, or even modern day standards. And, but the folks in Griffin Manor and the homeowners, failed to come together, and primarily for 2 reasons. Certainly, the crisis at Love Canal, just as any economic crisis, every environmental crisis, almost every societal crisis in America sort of peels off the underbelly of the neighborhood and exposes the prejudices that existed there quietly beneath the surface for years. And that was certainly a part of it. The other was just a failure to understand the situation. The homeowners were invested in their homes and had everything in them. And again, these were not wealthy people. They were factory workers, and they were obviously naturally concerned about getting their money out of their homes, getting their mortgages paid, or getting bought out. And homeowners believed that the folks in Griffin Manor could just move away. And they didn't understand that for someone like Aline or many of the other families there, that really wasn't possible. Because there wasn't public housing that existed for a family of 6. Or if there was an apartment in one of those other public housing developments in the city of Niagara Falls, it wasn't as safe or as nice as Griffin Manor. And so there was sort of a disconnect there. But to me, what became obvious as I dug in on this research is it wasn't just about people at Griffin Manor arguing with homeowners. Homeowners argued with homeowners. Everyone was arguing with everybody. At times there were 4 or 5 different groups that emerged, fighting for different things. Some people didn't even want to leave this neighborhood and actually would make that case. So it was a very complicated and stressful situation.
There was no perfect solution. So it wasn't like they could say, we all want this one thing. It was so complicated.
But as Lois Gibbs will say today, and she is still alive, and she did spend the next 40 years working in environmental justice and consulting with other people around the country about how to solve these kind of problems in their neighborhood. As Lois says today, if they had come together, if the homeowners and the residents of Griffin Manor, if everybody had presented one argument and had found a way to do that, she believes they would have escaped their homes much sooner, all of them.
Yeah. Another character that her story is so heartbreaking is Luella Kenny. Why don't you talk a bit about John Allen? It's such a heartbreaking story, and then how she became involved.
So Luella Kenny is another prime protagonist in the book and a key person historically in this story. Just like Lois Gibbs and Aline Thornton, Luella was a mother, and she had 3 boys who lived just north of the old canal lands, the playground and school. She was 1/10 of a mile to the north of it on a street called 96th Street. And they lived at a little elbow turn in the road there, and their house had a much larger yard than most others. It sort of backed up into a confluence of creeks on the northern edge of the neighborhood. And in the spring of 1978, Luella is aware of the issues at the land, but at that time in the newspapers, it was still being written that it was mostly an issue on the southern edge of the neighborhood, which really was like a mile away from Luella's house. So she wasn't that fixated on it. It was just sort of background noise. And then John Allen, her son, begins to get sick with a mysterious set of symptoms that local doctors, cannot solve, cannot decipher. And I really, in my early research for this book, as I started to track down folks who were still alive, and I did an early interview with Luella Kenny, I recognized the importance of her story and her family's story here. It didn't get a lot of press in the late 70s or early 80s when this was unfolding in real time. This was, again, for folks who remember it, this thing was like a snowball rolling downhill. And, it was just like one crisis after the next. And little little but tragic stories like the Kennys just sort of got swept up into that snowball and rolled right past. And so, I did phone interviews with Luella about what happened to her son, what happened to her family. And then I went to her house in Western New York, and Luella still lives in Western New York. She's about 10 miles away from Niagara Falls now. And Luella, like a lot of the important people in this story, kept everything from this time, records and documents, but most importantly, Luella kept her family's medical records from this time. And I'm talking about hundreds of pages of medical records. And, it was really in Luella's dining room in her home in Western New York, going through these medical records, that I realized that I was going to be able to bring this whole time in her family back to life on the page. And that's when I sort of felt in my core that Luella and John Allen and his struggles and his fight here will really be like the emotional heart of this story.
Mm. One of the things that was so impressive was the citizen science that the women did to collect the research in the neighborhood, and to document the health problems. Why don't we talk about how they collected their data, but also kind of more importantly, how it was discredited?
So the women were assisted early on by a woman named Beverly Pagan. Beverly was not a resident of the neighborhood. She lived 25 miles away, and she worked in Buffalo as a medical researcher and a PhD level biologist. But maybe just as important, Beverly Pagan was a mother. And she had specifically done research in the 70s that connected environmental hazards to human health. Beverly had done studies suggesting, again, scientifically, that smog and air pollution contributed to lung disease and asthma. She did other studies that suggested scientifically that cigarette smoking might just be connected to cancer. And so, of course, when these problems emerge in Niagara Falls, a short drive from Beverly's lab in Buffalo, she goes out there. And Beverly starts running her own tests. And Beverly begins to believe pretty early on that the problems and the risks extend much further than state health officials are saying at the time. And this puts Beverly Pagan in a difficult position because the medical institute that she works for in Buffalo is affiliated with the university at Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo State University. And actually, her medical institute technically falls under the umbrella of the State Department of Health. So, Beverly is a state employee and actually an employee of the Department of Health. And so when she begins to make statements, first privately, then publicly, that she believes the risks are greater than folks are saying in Albany, she is directly contradicting what the top health officials are saying in Albany. And she begins to pay a price for that. And she knows it's happening, but she still continues to assist the residents. And one thing they begin to do is run their own surveys, run their own epidemiological data gathering operation. And they begin to believe that this problem can't be hemmed in by a street map. You can't evacuate based on streets because chemicals don't care about streets. You have to think about how the chemicals might have traveled. And going back to when this land was still a ragged waterway, an abandoned canal in the early part of the 20th century into the middle part of the 20th century. If you look at aerial photographs of that time, a series of stream beds, some of them quite large, cut through the canal, crisscrossing it north to south, east to west. Some of these stream beds were actually like 20 feet wide, 8 feet deep. A child could stand in them and be dwarfed by the size of these stream beds. And in fact, there are photos of that. And they began to believe that there were clusters of health problems that followed these stream beds, or swales as they were known. And Lois Gibbs and Beverly Pagan began to call it the swale theory. And they gathered data that found clusters of problems around the swales. And they presented that. Beverly did first in a private meeting in Albany in November 1978. And when she flew there for this meeting, she believed that she was going to be heard out on this. She wasn't coming, to create a problem. She was coming to say, I have additional science that I think might add to the conversation. And the health officials listened to her that day. The meeting lasts all day. And then in the next day's papers, the top health officials who had been so conversational the day before reject this data in the newspapers in quotes that they would have given as they left the room that day. And one of the things that they say about this data that the women have gathered is they call it useless housewife data. And it's stunning to think about that now. Just the misogyny and the chauvinism of that statement. But Beverly in particular wore it like a badge of honor. And in fact, at a later hearing that she would attend with state officials, she wore a badge that had her name and it said expert on useless housewife data.
That's amazing. Yeah, she's quite the hero of the story. To move on to sort of the solutions and the kind of political issues, why was this such a huge test of political will? Like, it seems like here's a problem, let's fix it. But it was such a journey to get there. What happened?
Well, it was unprecedented. I mean, a chemical landfill buried in the heart of a neighborhood around which a school and a playground and houses and a public housing development had been built. It's unprecedented. And it was going to be quite costly. And also, to be fair to the health officials who were wrangling with this at the time, no one knew where to draw the line. What level of risk is acceptable? And where do you draw that line? And by the way, those questions, what level of risk is acceptable and where do you draw the line? That's an issue that health officials and environmentalists and residents of far too many communities are still wrestling with today as we deal with other issues related to chemical contamination or PFAS contamination, the so-called forever chemicals. So those questions are very hard to answer in any kind of definitive way. Because when it comes to issues of chemical contamination in particular, or pollution in particular, even smog, say, there's no direct line of causality. You can't say very often why one person's health problems exist. Is it because of the chemicals that are buried in the ground, a half mile away or 300 yards away? Is it because of the PFAS levels in their well water? Or is it just a thing that happened? And so, state health officials and then federal health officials are wrestling with this problem. And then you have an issue of liability and ownership. Of course, the Board of Education believed, Hooker was responsible, and Hooker believed the Board of Education was responsible. And here's this orphaned site, essentially, that was put there decades earlier. And so it leads to multiple things, but among them, in Washington, just as Beverly Pagan is starting to meet with state health officials in New York and say, just as she's beginning to say, I think the problem is bigger, EPA administrators in Washington are beginning to say the same thing. But they're not thinking just about the issues in Niagara Falls at Love Canal. They do a tabulation of how many other orphaned hazardous waste sites there might be in this country. And they determine it's hundreds of them that predate the EPA. Because remember, the EPA didn't even come to existence until 1970. And so, they're now going back through records and saying, my goodness, we might have 600 of these. And so they begin to push in the fall of 78 and then into the spring of 1979 for new legislation. And these EPA administrators, lawyers and environmental scientists actually begin to build this legislation for a large fund of money, a super fund, some began to call it, that would give the EPA authority and also financial power to come in and clean up these sites. And of course, as folks will know, the Superfund, legislation is ultimately passed as a result, really, of the resistance at Love Canal, and has still, for better or for worse, shaped the U.S. response to hazardous waste sites for the last 40 years.
A number of the questions that came in from audience members are sort of grappling with what can people do about issues today, and are there toxic, berry toxins that you've discovered since then in other areas. There's a lot of PFAS issues around here, or around where I am in New Hampshire. So I think people are sort of saying, what lessons can we take from Love Canal and from the work that Lois and all the people did for today?
So sadly, as those questions indicate, we're still grappling with our own problems today. And just a couple weeks ago, I did a story for the Washington Post about the PFAS issue, the forever chemicals. For folks who don't know, these are chemicals that are very prevalent in everyday products. They're used to increase durability and also make things stain-proof and waterproof. They're in your pans, they're in raincoats, they're in your shoes or jackets, and they're also in wastewater. PFAS is, because there's so much PFAS being used over time. It's turning up in wastewater, it's turning up in wells, it's turning up in the ground. And they call them forever chemicals because they don't go away. They don't dilute by and large. They aren't soluble. And so once they're here, they're here. And my story for the Washington Post was about a farm, actually, an organic farm in rural Maine, in Unity, Maine, where the young farmers, a couple in their 30s, just learned over the winter that their well, their soil, and indeed some of their crops were contaminated with PFAS, again, on an organic farm. And they had to piece it back together with the help of the state of Maine to realize that this problem actually was put in the ground there, and maybe dozens or hundreds of other sites in Maine 30 years ago, when municipal treated sewage, essentially biosolids is what the industry calls it, was used as fertilizer on the land. Unfortunately for this farm, the one of the districts where they got that fertilizer, the old treated sewage, was Waterville, Maine, where there was a large paper plant. And by the way, in many paper products, paper plates, paper bowls, they're made with PFAS. And so, now in Maine right now, they're wrestling with this massive problem of PFAS contamination and what to do about it. And back to the original question, what can we do? I've spoken to a lot of environmentalists and activists and also lobbyists over the course of this research, both for my book and my recent story. And, there's a tendency, I think, for all of us at times when we look out at the world and the things that are happening to sort of throw up our hands and say, I can't stop it, or I can't change it. And I think what I take away from the story and the protagonist at the heart of my book is that the only way to change anything is with persistence and resistance again and again. The big things and the little things. You know, the attending of marches and protests, but also the lobbying and the activism through normal political channels. In the history of the United States and US environmental history, almost no changes have come from the top down. The changes, whether it was the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or the EPA or the Superfund Act, or just the attention that various sites have gotten over the years, has almost come from the bottom up.
Yeah, the reality of all of the pollution, it's so bleak, but this story is so inspiring. So really thank you so much for bringing it to us. And I think we're at our time. I think there's links to buy the book. We have signed copies at Water Street Bookstore. The link is waterstreetbooks.com, and Keith is always happy to personalize, so you can put a little note in saying if you want him to sign it to the environmentalists in your life. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Keith, so much. This was great.
Thank you, Steph, and thanks to Boston.com, and thanks for everyone for coming out on their lunch break. It was great to have this conversation.
Thank you.